Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 65 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we are going to talk about some Dynasty busts for the upcoming season, players that I think will be disappointing to you. So I have a few different names at each position to talk about. And before we do, I want to remind everyone, as always, make sure you are following this podcast on your platform of choice. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, you name it, we're there. So go give us a follow so you don't miss any future shows. Leave us a 5-star review if you feel so inclined. We greatly appreciate it. That really helps out the show. And make sure you are following us on social media as well. So we're on Twitter or X at Dynasty War Room. And we have a Facebook page, YouTube channel. So go find us on all of those various platforms. And you can find myself as well at Andrew V. Court. And let's move on into today's show. But first, a quick word about my friends at Fast Draft. So Fast Draft is a new fantasy best ball app. It is a super quick and fun way to draft. It takes some of the grind out of fantasy football. And Fast Draft is giving away over $250,000 in prizes this year with all sorts of different tournaments. So all rookie tournaments, all flex tournaments, even all defense tournaments. So there's something new and different for everyone that wants to be drafting throughout the offseason. The drafts are only 20 seconds per pick, so you can wrap up a draft in just about 5 minutes. And if you sign up with code WARROOM, Fast Draft will double your first deposit up to $50. So that's WARROOM, all one word. And if you use that code WARROOM, you'll double your first deposit on Fast Draft today. So go get the app, download it, use code WARROOM, and enjoy some very quick and fast drafts. All right, so moving on into fantasy football busts. So it's a bit of a tough category to define. So I want to lay out my parameters here for what I was taking into account for who I'd consider a bust. So what I went with was simply a player that will disappoint you this year, and it could be related to a number of different factors. So it could be related to where you picked them in the draft. So if it's a startup in Dynasty or in a redraft league, based on where you picked them, you're going to be underwhelmed. Could be about the trade cost or the acquisition cost for that player. If you had to give up a lot to get them, you might end up being a bit disappointed. Could be related to inconsistency. So a player that you never really know if you can actually start because they have a couple spike weeks and then they're not startable the rest of the time. Of course, could be related to injury. That's a bit harder to predict, of course, but that is going to factor into a few of the names today. And then, of course, just in general, just being flat out bad, not getting on the field, not being usable at all in fantasy football. That's a bit more rare to find, of course, but that happens every year where there's a couple guys that just fall off a cliff. So players that are going to disappoint you. Players that I probably are not going to be rostering at their given cost. And I have a few different names at each position. I have two players picked out at each position, along with an honorable mention at several of them. So let's kick things off with quarterbacks and start off with one that is probably going to be more on the hotter take side. And I'm going to go with Jordan Love. So Green Bay Packers quarterback, currently on Keep Trade Cut. His dynasty value is QB 12. And this is a tough player to go with right off the bat for me, but it's something where I am concerned not just about Jordan Love's ability to be an upper echelon quarterback, but I'm very worried about the weapons around him. So this is a player that struggled with injuries last year. I think we all can realize that factored into the step back he took. He missed a couple games. He battled a variety of different injuries, and he was down more than 3 points per game last season compared to 2023. And that's a big difference at a position like quarterback where you have lots of good, solid, middle-of-the-pack options. So if you're looking at somebody like Jordan Love that at QB 12 is being considered on that QB1 border, there's going to be other players that you could go with, and you might end up with significantly better production. So I am worried about the Packers offense. They added Matthew Golden, but they're going to lose Christian Watson for much of the year. Obviously, this is going to be a bit more of a run-heavy offense still with Josh Jacobs, who I do like. And there's a real chance that the Packers are the last place team in the NFC North in 2025. I know that's kind of a crazy thing to say because the Packers have been such a good organization for so many years, but the Lions, certainly the favorites to win the division again. The Vikings, very good team. Quarterback change, so a bit, a wider range of outcomes potentially. And then the Bears, second year for Caleb Williams. They added some more weapons, new coaching staff, likely to take a step forward as well. So, this is a division that all four teams have very real playoff possibilities, and someone's going to have to come in last, and it very well could be Green Bay. So I just am a bit skeptical. I think that there are other quarterbacks in this range that I would rather have. I know that the injuries affected him, but I think that what we saw last year might be a little bit closer to who he actually is than 2023. And I think the big concern that I have in terms of his fantasy scoring comes down to his rushing ability. So he can move a little bit. In 2023, he ran the ball enough to where he had a solid baseline. He averaged over 18 fantasy points per game, and last year was down at 15 points per game. And the rushing played a huge role in that. He hardly ran the ball at all last year. Now, certainly I think that's because of the injuries, whether it was the shoulder injury, the leg injury. He was trying to avoid getting hit. And part of me thinks, well, now that he's had a few bouts with injury, he might be a little bit more careful about running the football. And we've seen players do that over the years where they just pull it back a little bit, and all of a sudden, instead of 200, 300, 400 yards rushing, you're looking at less than 100. And that's kind of what I see playing out here. I think he'll have a little bit of a step up from last year because hopefully that knee injury has had more than enough time now for him to get fully healthy. But he might try to avoid taking some hits, might run out of bounds a little bit more, might throw the ball away. He's got Matthew Golden now to hopefully have a better option in the passing game. So I don't know that the passing game is going to take a huge drop off. I think that could be largely similar, but I think you're looking at potentially more of the same from last year out of Jordan Love. And to me, that's not good enough for where he's currently being drafted at QB 12 in Dynasty. And I just don't think he's a QB1. I don't think he's going to finish in the top 12 at the position this year. I think he's more of a middle of the pack QB2, somewhere that, QB 12 to QB 18, probably more of the appropriate range for him. Still a very startable player in a Superflex league. So don't hear what I'm not saying. It's not like he's not going to be good at all. This is not one of those situations. This is more of a draft capital, injuries playing into it, just being a bit underwhelmed given what you probably had to pay to acquire him or where you had to draft him. I think he's a fine QB2 in Superflex, but he's certainly not somebody that I'm relying on as my QB1 if I can help it, and is not somebody that I'm looking to have in redraft. Now, the second quarterback on this list is Sam Darnold. So we talked a bit about Sam Darnold in the Cells episode a few weeks ago. And so it's a bit of a double dip here, and there's a couple players later on, especially a running back, that are in the same bucket. But I struggled with going through the quarterback position and finding guys that I really thought were going to be huge disappointments. So I just kind of defaulted back to, all right, who are players that I just simply am not trying to add at all? I'm not going to draft them. I'm not going to trade for them. Unless the cost gets so cheap that, they're practically free, I'm just not going to do it because I don't believe in the player. And I don't believe in Sam Darnold. I just don't think he's that good. That's simply all it comes down to. I think he had his best season that he will ever have last year in Minnesota. It was an awesome system. We've seen it work now for Darnold, Kirk Cousins, and he got his contract. He moved on to Seattle. Minnesota was not very interested in the possibility of re-signing Sam Darnold. They certainly did not make very much of an effort to do so. They let him walk. They didn't franchise tag him, anything like that. And he got an okay contract in Seattle. He's certainly better probably than what he expected this time last year. And so good for Sam Darnold for that. I mean, that's a great accomplishment. Happy for him as a person. But in terms of a fantasy football quarterback, he's not a running quarterback, so he's not going to give you that baseline that we like. And he's in a worse system with worse weapons. It's a run-first attack. And I just don't see the possibility or the excitement level there for him to be a QB1 or even a high-end QB2. I think we're talking low-end QB2. And the Dynasty value, I think, does a better job of reflecting that. His redraft value, of course, is going to be higher than his Dynasty value. And I'm just not looking to add him in either situation. Seattle drafted Jalen Milroe, who I also am not a big fan of, but at the same time, I think it shows you that there's, they're adding some insurance to their bet on Sam Darnold. They got rid of Geno Smith, who we talked about on the show, was just a player that I thought was okay. He's fine. And Sam Darnold could be essentially the same exact player as Geno Smith, which is fine. But it's not a player that I'm excited about. It's not someone that I'm going out of my way to add to a roster. And I think there's a more real chance compared to Geno Smith that Sam Darnold just falls apart and crumbles, given the pressure that he will likely face. We saw how much he struggled when he got blitzed at the end of last season, both against Detroit and then in the playoffs. It was a very quick unraveling after a very, very good season. So I don't want to take anything away from what he accomplished. I just don't see that continuing in the future. And if you look at it, he was a top 12 quarterback last year, and it's something where he wasn't, it's not like he was a top 5 guy. He doesn't have top 5 potential even in the arsenal as a possibility. Now, his price at QB 26 in Dynasty value is low enough that I'm not going to go crazy about it. I didn't love putting him on this list because I don't think the value is egregious, but he's just a player that I think falls into that category of he might be so inconsistent that you can never start him, or a player that I just think ends up being bad by the end of the year. All right, so my honorable mention at the quarterback position, so a player that I think the situation is ripe for him to be a bust, but I'm not ready to fully commit, and that is Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins. He is QB 25 on Keep Trade Cut, and I think he's a very talented player. He played well at times last year, and he's been a pretty good quarterback over the past several years. He's been able to produce some high-level fantasy receivers, but if you look at things outside of the price tag, I think this is something where the bottom could truly fall out in Miami. I mean, this team took a huge step back last year. The wide receivers are having issues. I mean, Tyreek Hill, both injury issues, but then a huge lack of production. That could have been because of the injury. But of course, there was also the style of play change where Miami started shifting into more of the quick, short passing game instead of these downfield routes that they had a lot of success with Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. So if the offense stays more of this quick-hitting game to Devon Achane, to Jonnu Smith, trying to protect Tua because the O-line is not very good, and that plays into things as well. So I'm very on edge with Tua. I think if he were to stay healthy and the team, if Mike McDaniel lives another year and gets to come back for another season after 2025, then this will all, I think, will settle down. I'll feel much, much better about it. I don't think this is something where I'm fully giving up on Tua or anything of that nature where I might be compared to a Sam Darnold, but I'm very wary of the situation, and I'm probably not looking to add him unless it's for a solid discount or he falls in a draft, something like that. But I'm not necessarily that excited about clicking the draft button on him in a startup or a redraft league, right now, given his current situation. All right, so moving on over to the running backs, and I mentioned the Sells episode, and there's a couple names here that are going to come up, but I wanted to go into those players a little bit more as to why I think they're not only Sells, but also true bust candidates. And the first guy on the list is going to be James Cook from the Buffalo Bills. So his value has dropped a bit over the last few weeks since we did the sells episode, and he's down to running back 16 on Keep Trade Cut, which I actually think is much more palatable at this point. Running back 16, I think, falls in line a lot better with where he might end up. So I think some of the reason he's on this list as a bust comes because of the name value. I think some of the more sharp Dynasty players have already moved him down as given these rankings. But most players, and especially the casual players in your leagues, they still see James Cook and it's big name, 1 billion touchdowns on an awesome team, all that sort of thing. I think this is a guy that was being traded for mid to late first round picks last year. And I think you can still get that in a trade, even though I think there's going to be some serious regression coming, especially when it comes to touchdowns. This is a guy that I would expect, single-digit touchdowns, maybe close to 10, but I don't think we're seeing anything close to, the number of touchdowns he had last year, which I believe was close to 20, if not 20 itself. And I'm a little bit nervous about that. The contract dispute that's going on with the Buffalo Bills makes me nervous. He's not showing up to some of the offseason stuff. There's rumors about, whether his house is on the market, silly stuff like that may or may not be true. But it's just one of those things where the team doesn't seem like they're very ready to commit to James Cook as the long-term option. They have other running backs that they are perfectly fine with giving the ball in Ray Davis. We've seen them in the passing game with Ty Johnson. So I'm a bit on edge with James Cook, and I am not trying to draft him in redraft. I am not trying to buy him in Dynasty. This is a true sell candidate because I think he's probably more in line for a mid RB2 type of season, and I think that's going to leave a lot of people disappointed, especially given how good he was last year as an RB1. So I would be looking to move on, especially if you can find someone that still really values him given the past production and the name value, because I just think you're in for a step back. The market is already starting to anticipate that, and the longer it goes into the offseason, I think the more his value might drop. So James Cook, the first player on this list. All right, now the second running back is Isaiah Pacheco from the Kansas City Chiefs. So another guy that I had as a sell. He's RB29 on Keep Trade Cut, and this is a player that is on the list. It's a very different situation than James Cook. James Cook, I am still fine with having on a roster. If you're counting on him as an RB2 or 3 and you want to start him, perfectly fine. I just think you might be a bit underwhelmed. But with Isaiah Pacheco, this is a situation where not only might you be underwhelmed, he might be somebody that simply is not a starter on his own team by the end of the season. I mean, he might not be the starter of the team, by week 2. I mean, there is Kareem Hunt that is still going to get some work. They drafted Brashard Smith in the 7th round. And between the injuries, there's a lack of commitment from the team. He's not gotten a contract extension. He was a 7th round pick. He's not one of these explosive players that's going to break off these huge runs because he has elite speed. So I think this is something where he's a solid player, but he is very much replaceable. And Kansas City has not shown that they are willing to spend a lot of money on this position. And I think that puts him in real trouble of being almost completely unstartable in fantasy. So not to say you won't get any weeks where you can't have him in a lineup, but it's going to be something where you might be trying to guess what week, what matchup, can you really put him in there? And he might just be more of a bye-week replacement guy that you just hope and pray that you might get something from him. But he's not someone that I'm going to be counting on a week-to-week basis, and I would be trying to move off of him. I'm very scared of the situation. I could be entirely wrong. I mean, he could end up being the starter, and this is all just a lot of worry about nothing. After all, the team did not draft a high-level running back in the draft, but I just don't really see the high-end upside for Pacheco anymore. I think he kind of is capped out as a mid to low end running back 2, which is fine, but I don't think he's going to get there, and I don't think he is really a player that I'm looking to add to any teams. All right, now my honorable mention at the running back position is one that hurts me a bit more because I am a Lions fan, and I have David Montgomery as my honorable mention bust at the running back position. Running back 24 on Keep Trade Cut, and he's been a very good, productive player over the course of his entire career. But this is a situation in Detroit where a lot of things are suddenly different. So we already had the coordinator changes, and seeing how the offense was going to look with the new coaching staff. But Frank Ragnow, the all-pro center for the Detroit Lions, probably the best center in the league, if not top 2 or 3, is retiring. So he is gone. He's out of the picture. The Lions will probably be looking to start a rookie. Tate Ratledge, second-round pick out of Georgia, will likely be the starting center. If not him, he'll slide over to guard, and it'll be Graham Glasgow, a veteran player that is an okay fill-in, but certainly not Frank Ragnow level. And I think this is going to hurt 2 players a decent bit. And David Montgomery is one of them. Jared Goff is the other. And because we've seen how Goff can struggle under pressure, and Montgomery is someone that over the past couple years has been he's kind of been the 1A from a real life standpoint for the Lions. He has been the starting running back, where Jahmyr Gibbs has come in and been the 1B, the change of pace, the explosive player that has still been really good for fantasy. But I think that might be changing in 2025. I think we could see Gibbs truly become more of the 1A, the pure starter, both in real life now and still for fantasy, whereas Montgomery might be relegated a bit more to the change of pace, give him a breather, the goal line guy. So it's not like he's not going to have any value, but I think he's going to be very touchdown dependent, where if he does not score a touchdown, you're getting 8 to 10 carries for 40 to 50 yards and maybe a catch or 2, but it's not going to be something where you're going to feel good about having him in the lineup if he's not scoring touchdowns. So I'm worried about that. I'm not completely cutting bait with him. I don't have him solidly on this list as a bust because maybe things won't change as much as I think. But I'm on the edge. I'm a little bit worried, and that's why he is on the honorable mention list, because I think the conditions are right for him to fall into this category. And again, that's more from a fantasy perspective. I'm not saying that Montgomery or any of these players will be busts necessarily in terms of their real life on-field performance or usefulness to a team. I think that especially is the case with somebody like Montgomery, who is probably much more important to the Lions in real life than he will be in fantasy. But it's just something where if you're counting on him as a top 2 running back on your roster, I would be a little bit worried and probably trying to find a way to add someone else to bump Montgomery down to your 3rd running back on your fantasy team. All right, so let's move over to wide receiver. And I actually feel pretty good about a lot of the receivers that are ranked pretty high right now. I think we've gotten better as an industry over the years and as a dynasty community, just fantasy football in general, at rankings, I think. There's not as many players where you look at a top 10, a top 20, and you go, oh yeah, that's the guy that, he's going to be a bust for sure, not drafting him whatsoever. I think at this point, there's a lot of pretty good players in the top 20, top 24, and for me, I had to go down a little bit more on the list and find guys that are probably certainly not being viewed as top 2 or even top 3 options on your team, but you might still be looking at them as starters or as flex options, and that's where Keon Coleman comes in. Buffalo Bills wide receiver, second-year player, wide receiver 46 on Keep Trade Cut, and second-year breakouts at wide receiver are usually pretty good bets, but I'm fading Coleman. I just don't think he is set up to be a good outside receiver in the NFL. If he were to be pushed inside as a power slot, I think he would do much better, but I don't think the team is going to use him that way. They didn't as a rookie. He didn't do a lot as a rookie in general. He only had 29 catches. He only had 4 games with 10 or more PPR fantasy points. And one of those games, he only had 1 catch. It was a deep ball, so deep ball for a touchdown, which is a nice skill to have, of course. But he's going to be inconsistent. You're never going to know when to play him. And he's still being drafted high enough, both in redraft and a dynasty, where he's probably going to fit in as a flex on your team, assuming you're in a league where the rosters are a bit bigger and most of my dynasty leagues, you're starting either 10 or 11 players, whether it's 2 receivers and 3 flex in a super flex, or you're starting 3 receivers and then 2 flex players. Whatever the setup is, he's probably someone that you're hoping will fit into one of those flex spots, and I just don't think that's going to be the case. I would much rather have Khalil Shakir, who was one of my favorite players from last year. Of course, if you listen to this show, we talked about him a ton last offseason, and I think there's a very real chance that Josh Palmer has a better season than Keon Coleman. So the Bills gave Josh Palmer some decent money, and I don't think Josh Palmer is a special player, but I think he can add something to this offense and be a bit more consistent than Coleman. And so I'm very worried about Keon Coleman. There's certainly the path. And if you want to find a second-year receiver that the cost is very low on because you just want to hope that you get the second-year breakout, that is something that happens frequently. This could be a very buy low type of guy, but I'm not doing it. I'm going to leave him for someone else. And, I hope for the Bills' sake, he can turn out to be a solid receiver. But I think he's being used wrong. And there are other passing game options that I would prefer to have, namely Shakir, Dalton Kincaid. And I would probably bet that Josh Palmer has a better year in redraft than Keon Coleman. All right, now the other receiver is someone that is getting up there in age. This might be a little unfair because he is not being valued very highly, but Cooper Kupp is going to be the next guy on the list from the Seattle Seahawks now. He's moved on from the Rams, and he's wide receiver 60 in Dynasty. He's being valued considerably higher than that in redraft. Now, it still isn't in the top 30 or anything like that, but a player that I think, again, people are drafting to be a flex guy, and it kind of goes a bit hand in hand with Sam Darnold because I just don't think it's a very good offensive situation, but he's the clear number 2 in the offense behind JSN. We have to worry about injuries and age now, and certainly as he gets into his 30s, the injuries are not going to become less of an issue. And so if he can't stay on the field, he's the number 2. It's a worse quarterback, a worse offense in general. And the Rams very much wanted to move on, which to me indicates that he's probably about done being a useful fantasy option. Not to say he won't have a couple good weeks, be a decent best ball player or something like that, but he's not someone that I'm trying to add. If you can get something of decent value, if you can get a second-round pick for Cooper Kupp, I would make that deal. I'd be trying to move on, just get something, especially if you're not a slam dunk contender in your league. And if that's the case, then fine, hold on, because he's probably going to be more valuable to you than whatever you can get, because you're probably not going to be able to get much. But he's not a player that I'm drafting in redraft, staying away. In fact, I'm pretty much staying away. I mean, well, I shouldn't say staying away from everyone, because I am interested in Kenneth Walker. I am interested in Zach Charbonnet, and I am interested in JSN. So there are other pieces in that offense I think will be solid, but I just don't know that the passing attack is going to be strong enough to support more than one receiver. And so Cooper Kupp to me is just an easy pick as a bust for 2025. All right, so now I do have an honorable mention for a receiver that's a bit higher up the rankings. I wanted to make sure there was someone in the top 24 that I looked at and was like, I just think he's a little bit overvalued. Definitely could end up being a bust. Kind of a wide range of outcomes here. And that's going to be Minnesota Vikings wide receiver Jordan Addison. Wide receiver 22 on Keep Trade Cut. And he's been the wide receiver 23 and 21 in his 2 years in the league, which is perfectly fine. That is a good player to have. That is a startable player. That is someone that you can leave in your lineup, feel good about. But I'm a bit worried about his 2025 numbers because he's going to have a new quarterback, J.J. McCarthy, who, while not technically a rookie, is basically a rookie in terms of his experience, having missed all of last season. And that's likely going to mean some inconsistency, some ups and downs for the offense as a whole, even if J.J. McCarthy is very good, like I think he will be. So this is not something where I think his long-term value is completely nuked. I think this is more of a one-year drop, but it makes it so I'm not really willing to buy in at his current cost because I would rather wait and see him take a little bit of a step back and then buy in when he's dropped 5 or 6 or 7 spots in these value rankings, because Jordan Addison lives on touchdowns. Each of the last 2 years, his rookie year, he had 10 touchdowns. Last year, he had 9, but he's never reached 1,000 yards receiving. He's never been a top 20 receiver, and his upside is severely capped with Justin Jefferson. So to me, this is something where I would expect him to be more like wide receiver 30 this year, maybe 30 to 32, something like that, where he's more of a middle to low-end wide receiver 3 rather than a low-end wide receiver 2. And I think that will drop his value a bit. It will leave you in a spot where you're not always thrilled that he's in your lineup. So I think the inconsistency could definitely get you there. And then that would make him a nice buy candidate next year when his value does drop, because I still think he's a good player. I just don't know that he's going to be awesome in 2025. And I would rather hold off a year to add him back to any rosters. All right, now moving on to the tight end position, where I have 2 names. I do not have an honorable mention, but that's largely because there are just not that many players at the position, and finding good bust candidates is difficult enough as it is when it's a limited position like this. But I do have 2 names that I actually thought were pretty easy for me to pick out. And first on the list is Kyle Pitts, Atlanta Falcons tight end. He's tight end 11 on Keep Trade Cut in their Dynasty rankings. And I don't think anybody should be all that surprised by this. Kyle Pitts has been a frustrating, disappointing player every year of his career outside of his rookie season. He had that awesome first year where he had 1,000 yards, and then he's been underwhelming ever since, whether it's injury-related, just lack of offensive production as a team, as a player. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff, but I just don't know that it's ever going to happen for him in Atlanta. I think that he likely needs to move on to another franchise, and that could certainly happen in the near future. But if he remains in Atlanta this year as expected, I think he's going to be the third option in the receiving game behind Drake London and Darnell Mooney. And Michael Penix Jr. certainly seems like a solid quarterback with a bright future, but he's relatively unproven. And even if he does end up being a good player, like I think he will be, again, I just don't think that Kyle Pitts is going to have a big enough target share to where you're excited to start him on a week-to-week basis. Will he have some spike weeks? Absolutely. And he's a good athlete still, yes, but I think you're going to have to wait for 2026. You're just going to have to keep on waiting for him. And if you can afford to be patient and you have him on your Dynasty roster, but you have 2 or 3 other good options, I think he's a perfectly good player to stash on your bench for the future, because he is still very young. But I'm not counting on him as a starter. I'm not taking him in redraft. If you are having to count on him as a week-to-week, every matchup starter, you should probably explore some options to add either a better option or some depth. So when he inevitably does give you some inconsistent production, you have someone else you can pivot to. But I'm of the position that I would rather just see him succeed on somebody else's roster than to just have him on my team be a bust yet again. Which is probably what's going to be what happens, especially in redraft. In Dynasty, again, I think this is more of a just don't expect a lot from him this year and play for the future if you can afford to do so. But in redraft, I'm not touching Kyle Pitts unless I have to in a very, fallback tight end 2 type of situation for redraft. But I just think he fits the bust list perfectly. He's been such a disappointing player overall the past few years, and he's been drafted so highly in startups. I mean, there are several leagues that I'm in where the manager that drafted Kyle Pitts has had to do major work to fix their team to become a contender because Kyle Pitts, a few years ago, I know there's a listener of this show in our home Dynasty League, took Kyle Pitts in the first round. And if it wasn't for a couple other really good trades that worked out in his favor, Kyle Pitts would have essentially sunk his Dynasty team right off the bat. There's another here in the listener league, took him in I believe it was the 4th round, still having issues with that position. And it's just something where he has all the hype and potential in the world, but just not a lot of production to back it up. And he's been a very frustrating player to have. And so if you've been burned by him before, I do not blame you one bit for continuing to just move on from him, be out, and wait until he can prove you wrong. All right, now the final player on the list here as a bust is a player that had an awesome 2024 and is now being drafted as a top 10 redraft option. In fact, Fantasy Pros has him as the tight end 7 in their redraft rankings right now. And that's Jonnu Smith of the Miami Dolphins. Tight end 17 in dynasty value on Keep Trade Cut. And it's a very interesting situation for Jonnu Smith because there have been a lot of trade rumors this offseason. And if he does get traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers, as has been rumored, I think that would be very bad news for his dynasty value, for his redraft value. I think it would put him in a significantly worse situation because then you're talking about a tight end 1A, 1B situation with him and Pat Freiermuth on a subpar offense that runs the ball. Pittsburgh is a rough spot for fantasy this year. I do very much like Caleb Johnson, and I think that Freiermuth is a fine late round option, but I'm out on Aaron Rodgers. I think DK Metcalf is going to be in a bit of a rough situation, although he should get a ton of targets now with the Pickens trade. But for fantasy managers, you better hope that Jonnu Smith stays in Miami, because if he's traded, I think he makes a huge fall down the list in Dynasty and certainly in redraft. But if he stays in Miami, it's a bit of a mixed bag because he certainly could stay a very valuable player in that offense. However, he is a one-year wonder. He's being valued very high. Before last season, he had never had a top 10 season at tight end. And he's 29 years old. So he's due for some regression. I highly doubt that he's going to reach 88 receptions again. That's an insane number for him. I think that he will regress back to more, still a somewhat usable player, but as long as he stays in Miami, of course. But relying on him as a top 7, top 10 every week starter, I think is a pretty huge gamble and something that I'm not willing to do. I would much rather have him be a backup option or a flex option if you're in a Superflex tight end premium league where you can start multiple tight ends to get that good production. But if you're not in a tight end premium league, I would not be counting on him as a starter. I would be looking to trade him, capitalize on the production from last year, and see if you can get rid of him before there is an actual trade, because there's been some ups and downs. Maybe he's traded, maybe he's not. But who knows? You might be able to still get a pretty good high-end return for Jonnu Smith for an aging tight end that's only been good for 1 year of his career. So I think that's a good situation to explore, understanding that he could be fine, but either way, I think he'll be worse, significantly worse for fantasy football than last year, regardless of what team he plays for. And so I think this is a good time to move on because he just has bust written all over, given where he currently goes in drafts and how much you have to pay to acquire him. I just don't think it's going to be worth it. All right, so there you have it. There are all of my bust players for 2025. We have a few at each position. Jordan Love, Sam Darnold, at quarterback with Tua Tagovailoa as the honorable mention, James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco at running back with David Montgomery as your honorable mention, Keon Coleman and Cooper Kupp at wide receiver with Jordan Addison as your honorable mention, and Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith at tight end. So thank you all very much for listening. I want to remind you all to download Fast Draft. Use code WARROOM to double your first deposit. They're in the vast majority of the states in the U.S. Not in Michigan yet, so I know I have a lot of Michigan listeners, but keep that in mind for the next time you go out of state. And, of course, we will let you know once Fast Draft is in the great state of Michigan. But thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. And we'll be back next week with what might end up being a very special episode. We might have our very first guest on this podcast to do a Dynasty startup mock draft. So that will be very exciting as long as we can make that work. So make sure to come back next week for that episode. Thank you all very much for listening. My name is Andrew Valancourt. This is the Dynasty War Room Podcast.